Welcome. This is Gary Miranda with another episode of Wake the Happy Words. When I was younger and would sit on an airplane next to someone who asked me what I did, I would say I'm a writer. And when they asked me what I wrote, I would say poetry, which was a surefire way to end the conversation. Today, at 86, when I'm asked what I write, I say eulogies. It has the same effect. I mention this because today I'm going to talk about fixed forms, including the sonnet, an interest which isn't likely to be shared by anyone other than fellow poets, and perhaps not many of them. There are four sonnets in my collected poems. You've already heard one of them, namely the poem about my grandfather, Sonnet for Salvador. Today I'm going to share the other three, along with a poem in that most difficult of fixed forms, the Sestina. One of the most prolific sonnet writers of the last century was Edna St. Vincent Millay. She wrote about 160 of them, roughly the same number as Shakespeare, and some of them, in my opinion, as good as Shakespeare's. I don't know where Millay's reputation stands these days. She was hugely popular in the Roaring Twenties and beyond, and was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for poetry. But fame is fickle, and Millay's poetry fell out of favor when T.S. Eliot and the modernists took over the reins of Pegasus. By modernist standards, her poems were mediocre and even a bit sappy. I'm not the best judge in this, since I tend to think that most of the things that matter in life are a bit sappy, but judge for yourself. Here is one of her best-known sonnets. Sonnet 30, Love is Not All, by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Love is not all, it is not meat, nor drink, nor slumber, nor a roof against the rain, nor yet a floating spar to men that sink and rise and sink and rise and sink again. Love cannot fill the thickened lung with breath, nor clean the blood, nor set the fractured bone. Yet many a man is making friends with death, even as I speak, for lack of love alone. It well may be that in a difficult hour, pinned down by pain and moaning for release, or nagged by want past resolution's power, I might be driven to sell your love for peace, or trade the memory of this night for food. It well may be. I do not think I would. Before you badmouth a poem like that, you damn well better be able to write one as good. But I bring this up mainly to point out that both Millay and, obviously, Shakespeare wrote what is known as Shakespearean sonnets. The other kind, as you may recall from English 101, is the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. Both kinds have 14 lines, the main difference being that the Shakespearean sonnet has 4 rhymes in the first 8 lines, namely A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, while the more difficult Petrarchan sonnet has only 2 rhymes in the first 8 lines, that is A, B, B, A, B, B, A. I say more difficult, but that's in English. In Italian, the Petrarchan sonnet is relatively easy to write, since Italian has a wellspring of rhyming words, but in English it's a challenge. By comparison, no disrespect to Edna or Bill, the Shakespearean sonnet is downright wimpy. I'm proud to report that all of my sonnets are Petrarchan. The first, and I think best of these, is a sonnet that I wrote for my wife, Patty, before she was my wife. I hear you doing the math out there. As with Millay's poem, sonnets are traditionally love poems, and this one fits the bill even to the title. Love poem. A kind of slant, the way a ball will glance off the end of a bat when you swing for the fence and miss. That is, if you could watch that once up close and in slow motion. Or the chance meanings, not even remotely intended, that dance at the edge of words like sparks. Bats bounce just so off the edges of the dark at a moment's notice, as swallows do off sunlight. Slants like these have something to do with why angle is one of my favorite words, whenever it chances to be a verb, and with why the music I single out tonight, 18th century dances, made me think just now of you untangling blueberries carefully from their dense branches. People often think that fixed forms, such as the sonnet, make the writing of a poem more difficult. What this overlooks is the fact that a fixed form gives you something to work with over and above a blank page. Once you have the first line, you know that the fourth, fifth, and eighth line are going to have to rhyme with it, which frees you from considering the myriad words that don't rhyme with it. Personally, I resort to fixed forms mostly when I'm having a dry spell and need a little help to get the juices flowing. This next sonnet is such a poem. It wasn't until I was about halfway through with it that I realized what it was about, and so was able to give it a title. Eve in Eden. Blame ripened like strange fruit in his eyes. How could she avoid them? And she was aware lately of other signs. The tiger's sheer agility conjured danger. Dark skies strained toward even darker meanings. When flies stitched their hieroglyphics on the air, her fingers twitched, impatient. Everywhere she looked, warnings broke like bird cries. And she, who had named the weasel, ibis, snake, who had conjectured rain, watching it fit, would find herself at night lying awake beneath the anonymous stars, where she would sit for hours watching him sleep, confused by the ache of dailiness and knowing no name for it. A wonderful thing about poetry is that it can range from grand, sweeping statements like Matthew Arnold's "The world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new," to more minimalist observations like William Carlos Williams' "This is just to say I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox." I confess to having a weakness for the grand, so much so that I'm sometimes taken aback when someone admires a poem of mine that I consider merely personal. This next sonnet, which records a happy time shared by 4 people on vacation in Vienna, is an example, and I include it in the hope that there are some plums in the icebox people out there who will enjoy it. Vienna Foursome, for Al Salsic. We started out at the Griekenbissel that winter night, where a man whose face couldn't believe his fingers played the zither. The snow drove by like a taxi, shifting gears in intermittent traffic. We made ourselves the center of that cold world, we 4, content to live and let live, more than happy to be alive, then braved the weather to Steffenskeller and dinner. Such things add up. A life grows if you let it. Who's to say where nights like these might go, given a taste for laughter? Like a donut, you dunked my wife, or she you, in the snow. And if I loved your wife a little, and who wouldn't, does it matter? Can you tell me? Do you know? If you think Petrarchan sonnets might be hard to write, consider this next fixed form, the sestina. I like to think that the sestina was invented by some mad Frenchman who had to find something to do with all the syllables in the French language that aren't pronounced. It's a complex 39-line form consisting of 6 stanzas of 6 lines each and a 3-line stanza or envoy at the end. There are no rhymes, but the end words of the first stanza are repeated in a prescribed order as the end words of each of the next 5 stanzas. As if that weren't enough, the closing 3-line stanza has to contain all 6 words, 2 per line, placed in the middle and at the end of the 3 lines. So if we represent the words at the end of the first stanza as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then the words at the end of the second stanza turn these inside out and become 6, 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. And the words at the end of the third stanza do the same with these words, becoming 3, 6, 4, 1, 2, 5, and so on. Poetry Magazine calls it the babble of poetic forms, a virtual vertical verbal tower, a linguistic Jenga puzzle. Writers.com says that, quote, poets who want to challenge themselves will find great joy in tackling the sestina form, end quote. Either that or they'll find another line of work. Needless to say, it's hard to write a sestina. To write one that also happens to be a good poem is a minor miracle. The best one that I know in the language is by Elizabeth Bishop and is called simply Sestina. I'm going to read it here just to illustrate that miracles still happen. The words Bishop uses at the end of her lines are house, grandmother, child, stove, almanac, and tears. The stumbling block here is using almanac 6 times without it jumping off the page. This is what Elizabeth Bishop does with the words. Sestina by Elizabeth Bishop. September rain falls on the house. In the failing light, the old grandmother sits in the kitchen with the child beside the little marble stove, reading the jokes from the almanac, laughing and talking to hide her tears. She thinks that her equinoctial tears and the rain that beats on the roof of the house were both foretold by the almanac, but only known to a grandmother. The iron kettle sings on the stove. She cuts some bread and says to the child, "It's time for tea now." But the child is watching the tea kettle's small hard tears dance like mad on the hot black stove, the way the rain must dance on the house. Tidying up, the old grandmother hangs up the clever almanac on its string. Bird-like, the almanac hovers half open above the child, hovers above the old grandmother and her teacup full of dark brown tears. She shivers and says she thinks the house feels chilly and puts more wood in the stove. "It was to be," says the marble stove. "I know what I know," says the almanac. With crayons, the child draws a rigid house and a winding pathway. Then the child puts in a man with buttons like tears and shows it proudly to the grandmother. But secretly, while the grandmother busies herself about the stove, the little moons fall down like tears from between the pages of the almanac into the flower bed the child has carefully placed in the front of the house. Time to plant tears, says the almanac. The grandmother sings to the marvelous stove, and the child draws another inscrutable house. That's an impossible act to follow, but here is my Sestina, which I dedicated to the Greek students to whom I taught American literature when I was a Fulbright lecturer at the University of Athens. The repeated words are stones, names, rain, play, happy, and say. Are we having fun yet? Sestina, remembering your names. For my students at the University of Athens, 1970 to 1973. You were easier to teach than stones, but only slightly. And your names were longer than a long rain when children have to play indoors and are not happy. Whatever I had to say to you, I tried to say like Demosthenes with stones in his mouth, making happy noises to the sea. But your names tripped me up like a play on words in Greek, or rain-slick marble steps. But rain is beautiful, you say. As children, we used to play in Plaka, though the stones there were slick as glass. Our names are all like that, happy. Okay, forgive the unhappy metaphor. Forget the rain. I was talking about your names and how I could not say them. Your names were sharp stones stuck in my shoe, a play of 5 acts within a play of 5 acts that has no happy ending. The hero stones his unfaithful wife in the rain-soaked streets of, say, Seattle, calling her names I will not repeat, names no sane man can afford to play around with. But listen, you say, again, wanting me to be happy. They are as beautiful as rain, skipping the syllables like stones. And today, while the play of rain on stones is trying to say your names, I listen, happy. Until next time, this is Gary Miranda saying with Theodore Rethke, wake the happy words.